going on again this week is another example of a chance to look back at one of our fallen friends with the Dark Side of the Ring episode on Freebird Terry Gordy that was this past week. And I wanted to take a chance to talk about it because, you know, and again, I said this about the biographies and Dark Side sometimes are now getting conflated in my mind because so many of the biographies are sad stories, right, these days. But with Scott Hall, you know, Terry, it was another guy that all of his friends and his family loved him, and he was a great talent, and everybody had nothing but good things to say about him, but he couldn't not take pills, and, you know, that led to his downfall or whatever. But, you know, overall, this Dark Side was, you know, more about Terry on his own rather than a member of the fabulous Freebirds. I mean, that was covered, but it also went into Terry's life before and then, you know, the Japanese success he had afterwards. But they had good talking heads. I always get a kick out of David Manning, and Mick Foley was on it for his star power and admiration for Terry, and had Terry's kids, Ray and Miranda, myself, Jimmy Garvin. Did I mention Kevin Von Erich?
No.
And Richard Slinger, who I hadn't seen in ages. Terry's nephew, who worked for a while in the 90s. But
he was on the Night of Legends.
Yes, because he drove Terry up. And, you know, again, the old footage. This guy, he's, I don't know, 6'3" or whatever he was, and 300 pounds at various points in his career, and the way he moved and the speed that he had at that size, and at the same time, his shit looked vicious, but he didn't hurt you, but it looked violent, and he was animated when he was in the ring. And when I first, you know, when the Freebirds had first come to Memphis, this is before that they even had that run in Louisiana when pretty much they had just switched sides of Tennessee and come over from working for Nick because Jerry would let him play the music. You know, Gordy was amazing at that point, and they just fell right in. But Jimmy Valiant and Steve Regal were a babyface team here at that point in time, and they fell right in working a deal with them. And one night I remember that Handsome Jimmy, I believe he's a car accident or whatever the case, but Regal was by himself in Evansville, and they had a handicap match, and there's Gordy flying for Steve. Steve had hit him with a drop kick. Boom, he'd take a big bump, and he'd shoot him corner to corner and Terry upside down. And I'm like, this fucking guy's 18 years old. And he was always in the right place, and he knew how to feed people. And, you know, so anyway, when you see this old footage again of Terry, that just nobody in the business is moving that way or has anywhere near that kind of animation to them these days, do they? Who am I missing?
You're not missing anyone, and Mick Foley pointed it out about those punches, and those punches always look so good. And the footage was great here. I mean, even, it's been a while since I watched Terry Gordy's All Japan stuff. You know, after 88, let's say, I haven't watched that stuff in a while. It looked incredible here on this show, and I have to say, this is, I think, one of the better Dark Side episodes. I think they did a good job here.
And that's, talk about Terry's punches. He could do that and you wouldn't feel it, but Michael could throw that shitty, I mean, he had the good left that he developed later on, that left jab that Michael was doing in WCW in like 89, 90. That was okay, but the fucking right, Jesus Christ, it looked like shit and hurt. He got the tag from Brandon Baxter one night working for Randy Hales in Memphis. When they had the developmental program down there in 99. And Michael came in, the first thing he did was fucking punch me on top of the head so hard that my teeth fucking slammed together and it broke my front tooth off at the gum line, and I spit it out and caught it in my mouth. Anyway, so they had some of the old footage of Terry Mecca and Ernie Ladd from, I guess that was the IWA Einhorn program in 76, right? When he was 14, 15 years old. And then Terry Meeker was on the IWA offshoot in Nashville. That's that local show or local clip that you saw of him at that point. And I mean, you know, and we talked about, because when they were here, talked about Terry for a long time, and they didn't even mention, you know, they kind of glossed over the Mid-South run because Georgia, more people remember, and then World Class was huge. But the thing about this, I main evented the Superdome for the first time when I was 22 years old, and that was very, very unusual, right? And I was a manager. Terry Gordy main evented the Superdome as a wrestler when he was 19. That's unheard of. It was amazing. He was like Bobby Eaton. He was a natural, and they both were that good as teenagers, and were born as the crow flies, maybe 100 miles apart from each other.
Seeing some of that footage from Georgia in 1980, it got me thinking just what an amazing year they had. From Memphis to Mid-South to Georgia to World Class eventually after that. That's an amazing run, but just the year alone that got them to Georgia. And then everyone remembers who watched it, that first promo with the music playing and Gordon Solie introducing them on TBS.
Yeah, and I still get goosebumps seeing that, because that was, you see that footage of them with Solie standing there, his voice, it was a revolutionary gimmick for wrestling at the time. It was different than anything anybody else was doing anywhere else. And I was seeing that in real time. I've said before, you know, if I was going to go over to Norman Dooley's house, good old Weasel Dooley, we tried a time or two with the Madison Square Garden shows on MSG cable network, and they were such a letdown. If I was going to make that, you know, 45-mile round trip or whatever, and the price of gas back then, for me, it was going to be for Saturday Night Georgia Championship Wrestling, because that was the show everybody wanted to watch if you were a wrestling fan with cable or access to cable. And the Freebirds lit that show up. So, you know, that it showed that these guys, they in their various ways, they understood the wrestling business. By that time, Watts had added Buddy Roberts, so he was the veteran that kind of knew the psychology in the ring. Michael had always had the promo, and Terry was just a natural worker, and in his younger days, he would do too much because he could. And by the time that Buddy got around him and they got working with this main event talent that was a little more experienced, then Terry came along with, okay, I'm not going to let everybody fucking throw me 50 feet because I need to be a badass. And that was the last part. And then they were, you know, impeccable from that point. Each person served the function. And that was, you know, again, in those days, that's why I enjoyed so much the brief period of time in 85 that I got to live in Atlanta for Crockett before we moved all the way to Charlotte, because Pedicino had that wrestling block, and we ran Columbus, Georgia on Saturday night, and you could be back home by midnight if you lived in Atlanta, and Domino's was still open, and I would back the VCR up, and I had 6 hours of wrestling that I could watch until Sunday morning at 6 o'clock, and every TV show looked different, with different talent and different announcers and different styles of shooting it and presentation in the ring, and you could watch it and not get bored.
These things are the greatest two rectangles since the Ten Commandments.
But I digress. Anyway, back to the notes on Terry Gordy. And you know, that was the thing, is that they were kind of like the Midnight, in that we got over under Watts in Louisiana, and then, yes, we did go to Dallas, but we actually got the chance to get over for Crockett. They got over under Watts and got Buddy and learned a lot, and then got the chance to get over in Dallas, and that thing, it was it was also the difference in those two territories. Going from Mid-South Wrestling, you had heat everywhere, and we've talked about how brutal the fans were in the roads and etc. In Dallas, in World Class, you had heat, and especially in the other towns or the small towns and the spot shows. But out in public in Dallas, you were a TV star, and you could get anything you wanted. And so I'm not surprised that a lot of the World Class guys had issues, because you were literally treated like a rock star in Dallas, Texas. And, you could be jumped on the street in Baton Rouge. You might get jumped in the sportatorium in Dallas, but you wouldn't get jumped on the street. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, Jim, speaking of the streets of Dallas, I asked you when we previewed this episode, you think they'll have the reenactment of him headbutting the car, and you were saying, no, that was the Barbarian, and there it was. There it was.
All right, I forgot. They both headbutted the car. But, yes, they did have the reenactment, so I owe you the $5. But anyway, they covered also the cup of coffee that the Birds had with the WWF in 1984 and etc. And something that was this serious? Did Terry Gordy really contact Richard Simmons to lose weight when he had torn his ACLs in various Japanese matches? I had never heard that he had contacted Richard Simmons himself. That's my gimmick.
Right, and then that was actually his opening line, was, "I'm friends with Jim Cornette." No, he then described, I think it was his son, that Terry Gordy would do the workouts, but anyone who rented the videotape could do the workouts. Did he really call Richard Simmons or get in touch with him?
I need clarification on that. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall if that happened.
Did they have the same hairstylist? Is that perhaps how they knew each other?
Well, no, because Terry's curls were more natural, whereas I think Richard's were the result of a perm. But anyway, after they covered the big run in Japan and the team with Dr. Death, and again, you said like the footage there was incredible also. They went right to the flight. He had already OD'd once while he was over there in Japan at one point, and then this was actually the flight to Japan. Remember, he hadn't got there to start wrestling yet. It was on the flight over there that Doc had started doing CPR, but he went in the coma, and he was in the hospital over there for a number of days before, he could get out and come back home.
What do you think about learning that it wasn't the first time Steve Dr. Death Williams had to slap him in the face, try to revive him previously successfully, that it was a common thing?
Well, see, I guess you're not surprised anymore when you hear stories like this, because there are so many stories like this. But I don't know as to whether this was because with Terry was because of injuries or was because of the schedule, with the constant trips back and forth to Japan and the disruption of, whatever it is, is that how it started? Because I think his son Ray said, that they didn't really know how, drinking Jack Daniels and smoking weed went to taking pills, but that wasn't the Terry that everybody had known, in the Freebird days, right? He definitely going to party, but it wasn't like that.
Should they have put? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say in that genre or direction of substance. Go ahead.
Should they have pointed out that in 1986, when Vince had Hogan and the NWA had Flair, that Watts went with Gordy as his world champion?
Yes. Well, I mean, there was 45 minutes without commercials, so there's only so much they could do. But right. Yes, that's another thing that at that time, especially for Watts's presentation of wrestling, for a hard-hitting athletic product with guys that looked like they could fucking do damage, he was considered as a single a good enough guy to be the world champion of the number 3 promotion, and the two guys he was behind were no slouches. So I think that definitely is another aspect of Terry, just as I don't think people now know how well regarded he was both in the business for his performance, for his work, and for, how much the fans thought he was over. He was a big fucking name. It's just he started so young and it didn't last for long enough that, today's generation, I don't think, realizes, same thing with Dr. Death, some of the other guys, how they were taken back then. And that's, because think about this, at least Terry got a 13-year run on top in territories, 1980 to 93 before the incident, right? Or 92, was it? Regardless.
93.
93. But then, unfortunately, he's 32 years old and one of the best talents in the business. And think about if that flight had not happened and the coma hadn't happened, in the Attitude Era, he would have been 38 years old when Steve Austin was the hottest star of the business. And The Undertaker, he could have worked with all those fucking guys. And they made the mention at the end of the program, that's what we were all trying for. And that when I brought him to Smoky Mountain in 95, and we've talked about it, we had hope, everybody hoped. But it just didn't work. And the WWE, the Executioner, and by the way, Michael Hayes, after they said, well, in the voiceover, his old friend Michael Hayes got him the spot. Michael Hayes got on Twitter and said, actually, I was very happy. I'm paraphrasing. I was very happy he was here, but I didn't have anything to do with it. Michael was just an announcer at that point. It was JR. I put a word in. Bruce Pritchard being from Texas. I mean, Vince didn't have any personal attachment either way, and didn't particularly care. But at the same time, a lot of people, I think Mick said something, and he wasn't brought in to be Terry Gordy because he couldn't be Terry Gordy, but he was brought in because a lot of people thought that maybe he could fulfill a role there. And at the same time, he's 33 years old or 34 or whatever, and needs a job.
Imagine the other hand, though, what could have been if, like, 1996, you or Bruce or Jim Ross get a phone call from Terry Gordy saying, I love All Japan, I love the money, but I need a break. Would you be interested in using me? And he hasn't had any of these issues that have long-term effects.
Yeah.
Imagine that sales pitch if you guys had to tell Vince before the Attitude Era, when you had Brett and you had Shawn and you had Undertaker, Terry Gordy wants to come in. How do you think Vince would have used them?
Well, the fact that he was willing to just put the guy, because of what everybody else said about him and what he used to be, that he was willing to put the guy on the roster under a mask as part of Mick and Paul Bearer's little group. If he was the same talent he had been 5 years before and could talk and work and move like that, I don't know if he'd have been Terry. He might have just been Bam Bam. Whatever the fuck. If you just said, look, Vince, this guy against this baby face, that baby face, the other, the Undertaker. And Taker, that's why Taker was having matches with the Executioner, because he wanted to see if there was some way to have a match with Terry Gordy still left, but there wasn't. But, Undertaker and Gordy, I'm going to say, are they 4 years apart in age? Because a lot of people wouldn't realize that, because Taker started late, Terry started early, Terry finished early, Taker has become timeless, but maybe 4 years difference in their age, so they would have both been prime physical candidates at the same time. Taker would have fucking loved that. But I'll tell you what I was shocked by is that Mick saying that he was still taking pills in the WWF run after the coma. That's what hurt me the most, I think, to hear that, where he and Paul were having to kind of babysit and watch out for him. And he'd wander off and shit because he you know, he hadn't learned or thought, well, what the fuck at this point, right?
The saddest thing were those shoot interview clips they showed of him from like 2001 or whenever it was, or maybe it was a little earlier than that now that I think of it. And he can't answer anything, and he has no memory of anything whatsoever. And I mean, it's hard not to just feel bad for him even being in that situation, having to answer questions. It's awful.
Yeah, and you could tell that at some level he knew that he needed to be saying other things besides what he was saying, but he couldn't, and he kind of felt sheepish about it there and was apologizing. But and that, you know, that's the thing with Undertaker and Terry only being a few years apart. And Terry Gordy, if he was here today, would be 2 years younger than Sting, who just had his final match. But Terry had his first match in 1975, and Sting had his first match in 1985. But that, you know, we missed a lot with that. And Mick had always been a big proponent of Terry's. I was at one of the global shows in Dallas at the Sportatorium that Pedicino had put on.
91.
And I'd never, in the Sportatorium, I'd never been able to go out and watch the matches. We had a TV monitor if it was a TV taping, or otherwise you just guessed, right? Because if you went out, you were right in the people, and they'd fuck with you. But since there was only 200 people in the building, I was able to go out and stand at the top of the ramp and watch some of the matches. And I'm standing there with, I think Stan Lane was with me, I know some of the other guys, and Gordy's wrestling Cactus. And Gordy picked him up and power-bombed Cactus Jack flat on his back on the floor next to the ring. And in a Sportatorium, and we're all the way up the top of the ramp in the back of all of the bowl of seats, right? So it's like 100 feet down that rampway. And I felt it in my feet when he landed. Oh, I was, Jesus Christ, right? So later on, Cactus comes up in the back, and he starts to say something, and he coughs a little bit, he works up some phlegm, and he spits it out. And it's about half blood in this ball of shit that he just hocked up and spit out. And I said, Cactus? I said, that's fucking half blood. And he said, oh, it's better than it was a little while ago. It was all blood. That's my memory of Terry Gordy and Cactus Jack. Anyway, and you know, and it was nice that he got to spend time with his kids there because he was home more and etc. But he, you know, finished his career on, you know, indies around the house, and ended up, it was July of 2001 that he died at home in Soddy Daisy, Tennessee, which was also known as Freebird Mountain. And it was congestive heart failure, which, you know, I don't know, that could be caused by a variety of different health issues, but he was only 40 years old. So that's why I say he would have, again, 40 years old for a wrestler in 2001, he would have had his choice of any, you know, well, maybe 99 or 2000, but in 2001, he would have had still his choice of a couple of large contracts in a couple of large places.
Well, there it is, Dark Side of the Ring's Terry Gordy episode. Like I said, I think it's one of the best episodes they've had, and they did a good job with this. Next week, an interesting one, or this coming
All right,
week,
fans, come on back to Guardian of Chaos, the YouTube channel, here for Chaos Corner. I'll say that to say this. Don't you dare miss it.